Hello, welcome to Killer. This is your host, David, and with me is my co-host, Craig. What's up, sir?
I am doing good. Not a whole lot going on here. How are you?
Well, just getting back into the flow and fighting all the technical demons here. That's how it goes.
Yeah, we'll get back into the swing of things eventually. We'll get this thing nailed down.
Yeah, one of these days we'll act like we've been here before. But for now, we are not. Yeah, so in the last episode, we recapped the Delphi murder case, and we focused mostly on the events from the murders and the events right after. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on the trial of Richard Allen for the murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German. So we're going to talk through each day of the trial and discuss the events as they unfolded. But a quick disclaimer, there's a lot of graphic detail during the trial, so please proceed with caution. Viewer discretion is advised. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started.
You are listening to Killer, and this is the Delphi murder trial, part 2.
Lock your doors, bolt your windows, and turn off the lights. We're about to begin.
Before we get into the day-to-day coverage of the trial, we're going to first take a look and analyze the rules of the trial. The trial of Richard Allen commenced on Friday, October 18th, 2024. It was held in Carroll County, Indiana, and the jury selection took place in Allen County. The judge for this case would be Judge Francis Gall, and the jury would ultimately be made up of 7 women and 5 men, while also having 4 alternates, 3 women and 1 man. Citing convenience for the victims' families and witnesses, Gall said the cost of relocating Allen's trial would prove extraordinary. She acknowledged, however, that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to find Carroll County jurors who were not impacted by the tragic case, and agreed to bus a jury in from another county. Judge Gall had ruled the trial would not allow for any cameras of any kind in the courtroom. She also ruled that photographs and videos of the jury were strictly prohibited as they entered and exited the Carroll County courthouse. This means that most of the coverage we are discussing today is based off journalist notes recounting the events discussed from each day of the trial. One final thing to note, in the state of Indiana, the jury is allowed to submit questions to the judge, and she can ask them to the defense or the prosecution, which is something that they do quite frequently during this trial. This is not the case in every state, so it is worth pointing out here.
So let's start talking through the trial, starting with day 1, which was Friday, October 18th, 2024. On the first day of the trial, it was delayed by about 10 minutes as the court confiscated 5 still cameras and 1 video camera belonging to the media. So as Craig talked about at the beginning here, Judge Gall ruled that there were no photographs or videos allowed in the courtroom, no recording materials of any kind. And so, as we mentioned, as we're looking through the coverage of this case, there are some areas where you might find conflicting or different information than what we present here, and I found some of the same and tried to call that out where possible. However, everyone is kind of handwriting their notes. And one other thing that we didn't mention was there was sort of almost like a lottery system to get in. So there were only so many seats available. And so they weren't always letting all of the media in at once. And so some days, like certain media people would have access or to maybe the morning sessions, but not the afternoon sessions, and vice versa. So it's kind of interesting from a coverage standpoint. With such a high-profile case, like how it actually was covered, it was kind of archaic in a way. So there is definitely some conflicting information that you might come across to what we present. So just keep that in mind. But opening statements began around 9 a.m. and lasted for about an hour, with each side setting the stage for their case, following a short recess around 11 a.m. Judge Gall made a ruling that she would not allow for the use of sketches that were circulated as law enforcement officials searched for the person wanted in the murder case. So next up, Becky Patty, the grandmother of Libby, testified. She gave a very emotional testimony that lasted for roughly an hour. The one thing that she pointed out was Libby's last words to her were, "Grandma, I'll be okay," which was in response to her grandmother telling her to bring a jacket. Unfortunately, those being your last memories of what she said to you would be quite tragic in a way. I mean, don't you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Would be quite tragic. And just like we talked about in part 1 as well, Libby's grandmother experienced Richard Allen at the CVS when he gave her the photos for free for the funeral. So she's having to relive all of that again, and then thinking about the last things or interactions that she had. It's just, I can't imagine how emotional of a testimony that had to be.
Yeah, it would absolutely be extremely tough. I couldn't imagine having to testify for any of this kind of stuff and relive all of this stuff all over again in what was already a tragic case to begin with, but one that lasted so long.
Agreed. And it kind of hampers some of the details that, as we try to analyze this entire trial about, not having any recordings, no video, everything is, handwritten notes from journalists. But to some aspect, I'm kind of glad just because some of the other content that we're working on, there's a lot of graphic images out there for some other cases. And it's just, when children are involved, I mean, when anybody's involved, really, kind of thankful that we don't have to see some of that graphic imagery.
Right. And truthfully, that was back when we kind of put a pause on this show. That was part of the conflict I was struggling with at the time, was just the stuff that we talk about. It's really heavy. And it's interesting because it's sort of this weird study in human psychology to me. Like, that's probably why it fascinates me, because my mind is so opposite and my demeanor is so opposite to some of the people that we talk about and like the things that they do, that it fascinates me that how could somebody even be like that, or how could somebody even do that, and these kinds of things. And obviously there's some sort of demented, sick and twisted thing in your brain that makes you interested in it. But it weighed on me quite a bit, like deciding if is this something I want to do more of, and I do, yes, we're back. But at the same time, it doesn't go like without being in the back of my mind, that we're talking about real people, real events that actually happened, that hurt people, and trying to cover them in a way that doesn't necessarily, I don't know what the right word is there, but it's just tough. Right. And I don't want to what I would hate is if somebody ever came across our material who was actually impacted by something like this and then had problems with what we were doing or talking about, because I don't necessarily do that from a place of negativity. It's just from a place of fascination, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's just the informative nature of things like this, trying to understand, first of all, how somebody could do something like this. And second of all, trying to just dissect everything and just understand and draw the patterns and really just kind of sort it out in your own mind, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we'll continue on. Next to hit the stand was Libby's sister, Kelsey, and she was the one who took them to the trails that afternoon. And her dad, Derek, was supposed to pick them up at 3:30 that day, but when he got there, the girls were nowhere to be found. They repeatedly called the girls' cell phones, but neither of them answered. And the day continued on with Kelsey saying, she spoke to Libby's character and discussed dropping her off that day. And around 3 p.m., when Derek said they were missing, he testified to the same. And, at 4 p.m., Abby's mother, Anna Williams, testified. And again, she was there to sort of set the stage for the character of the girls, right? And so that was what her testimony involved. But one interesting piece from Anna's testimony was that the state asked Anna Williams about the evening of February 13th, and Anna testified that she was at work at a local restaurant when she received a phone call about the fact that they couldn't find her daughter or Libby. And she told her boss, "I don't know what these girls are up to, but I will be back." And she left to go look for the girls. And the final witness from the trial that day was Carroll County Sheriff's Department Deputy Mitch Catrone. He was asked about what happened on the evening of February 13th after the girls were reported missing. And he also says that he searched the trail briefly, but he also interviewed a gentleman named Mr. Weber who owns a home near the trail. And upon cross-examination, he said that he only spent about 5 to 7 minutes searching the trail, and that led the defense attorneys to ask why he didn't search longer, asking where he searched and why he didn't look other places. And while his testimony was expected to be quite lengthy, it only lasted 30 minutes. The jury did ask a couple questions, and they asked the deputy how often people walk the trail and then turn around without crossing the Delphi High Bridge. And he simply answered that he does not know, which was a good question. And again, it's an interesting thing that happens throughout this case where questions get asked by the jury to the judge, and the judge decides how to dole those out to the defense or the prosecution. So again, nothing like earth-shattering that day. It was mostly just setting the stage for what happened that day, the family's reactions, talking to the character of the girls, and that kind of thing.
No, I think it's an interesting piece of the investigation and the trial that the jury is allowed to ask questions and have them presented to the prosecution and the defense, because it kind of gives you the mindset of how they're interpreting the testimonies and how what their line of thinking is as we go through all of this information, right?
Yeah, and it's really fascinating, and like later parts of the trial where things start getting really technical, and they ask a lot of really good questions, questions that experts on the stand don't talk about until they get asked, and it's really cool in this case. And I honestly feel like that's kind of how all trials should be. It's, if you have questions like that, you should be able to ask the people while they're there so that you can clarify and get to the point of what the evidence is presenting or what the experts are testifying for, and try to understand better. So that way there is no room for doubt when it comes to certain questions somebody might have.
Yeah, remove all that doubt. And then when you recess to the jury chambers to talk about it, some of those questions or any kind of second thoughts you have may be answered directly.
Exactly.
So now we're going to move on to day 2 of the trial, which was Saturday, October 19th, 2024. Saturday's session centered around the initial reports of the day the girls went missing and the efforts to find them. Steve Mullen, who is the current investigator for the prosecutor's office and was the Delphi police chief in February of 2017, described his timeline of what happened on February 13th. Mullen said, "I figured the girls would return home. I didn't think anything bad happened." Mullen said he was off duty when he heard police scanner traffic that the girls were missing. He went to the Carroll County Dispatch office and stayed there the remainder of the night. Police ended their search at around 2 a.m. And one interesting point here is I've seen reports that the search was officially called off at 10 p.m. Mullen spent time explaining the geography of the trails in the surrounding area for the jury to better understand. He circled on a map the different locations the prosecution thought the jury would want to know of. Jake Johns, a Delphi resident, took to the stand next and testified to finding German's shirt while searching an area near the riverbank below the Monon High Bridge on February 14th. John said he was searching with another Delphi resident when they noticed German's tie-dye shirt in the water. He said the water was calm that day, but it was too deep and they didn't cross to look in the area on the other side of the Deer Creek. The final witness on the stand that day was Pat Brown. He is also a Delphi resident and a friend of German's grandparents. During emotional testimony, he described searching for the girls on February 13th and 14th. After getting a phone call, he says he headed to an area near the High Bridge, ultimately discovering the bodies. When describing the moments he came across German and Williams, he started crying and had to pause to collect himself before saying, "We found them." He did go on to say that he first thought they were mannequins. Brown says he called police and had to turn his back to the bodies while waiting for their arrival. The jury asked a couple questions, including clarification on Brown's phone provider the day he called from the area where the bodies were found, and a timeline for the arrival of police. The jurors were dismissed around 11:35 a.m.
Yeah, so as you can see, day 2 really centered around just that search. What did they do? Where were the girls at? Who discovered them? All those kinds of things. And it was nothing atypical of what we've seen before, but what was interesting there was that Steve Mullen basically said, I don't think anything bad had happened. What's the big deal? So immediately he's just thinking like, hey, small towns, Delphi, nothing happens here. They probably just ran off at a friend's house, doing who knows what, those kinds of things. But he was incorrect. And the other thing that was fascinating was there is a conflict in the timeline of when the search ended. So some said it was around 10 p.m., others say around 2 a.m. And I don't know which one was real, to be honest with you. I would say it's probably more likely than not that at 10 p.m. they stopped looking just because it got dark, at least in that area. Maybe there was still a search going on throughout the rest of the evening where they had BDs patrolling and looking around town, maybe outside of the the main area where the girls were reported missing from, but I don't know what the actual time was that they truly stopped searching.
Yeah, that sounds like a key piece to me. Not necessarily as far as the search and investigation goes, but just, 4 hours is a pretty big gap. Why would he report that they called the search off at 2 a.m., but yet there's some reports that they stopped at 10? I would think with 2 girls, and we know a little bit about them and some of the recordings that we listen to from their family and just different information, that they wouldn't just call it off and say, oh, they just ran off. It's not like, oh, they went to some unknown friend's house and they don't know how to get a hold of them. They know they have phones. They're going to call if they, if the plans change and they do something else. My assumption is they're going to call or text their parents and say, hey, I'm here, right? They're not just going to go radio silent, disappear.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you'd have the phone calls there. There's a million ways they could try to get in touch with the girls, and they could be available or whatever, and they're just not responding. And it wasn't like them. They use their phones all the time. They're posting to Snapchat constantly. They were posting while they were there. All of those things were happening, and yet they weren't found. The only thing, though, within that time frame that I think about, if I'm the defense, right, and I'm trying to figure out how to kind of strategize around what I'm thinking here is, and again, I'm calling this out, like, me personally, in the research I did, have seen this conflicting. I don't know if officially that is a conflicting timeline. I've just seen it reported differently in various places. So let's just say for a minute that it was truly 10 p.m., at least in the area that the girls went missing, that it was called off. That leaves a really wide range of time until sunlight, when the search would probably resume, which means you'd have a really good time window for somebody to go and dump bodies or move them or do whatever, in essence. So that opens up a larger timeline.
Yeah, it does. And even though, regardless if they stop the search party at 10 or 2 or whatever, speaking strictly as a parent of young children, we both are, right?
Yep.
You haven't heard from your children. Say they call off the search party at 10 a.m. You haven't heard from your children that day. It gets to be 10 o'clock at night. They call off the official police search. Do you think there's any way possible, and maybe it did happen, I'm not sure, but is there any way possible you're sitting at home waiting to hear from authorities about where your kids are?
No, sir.
Are you going to be out in the woods in that creek area and that bridge area, stomping through mud all night long?
I'm going to go get a massive supply of flashlights, and I'm going to go start looking. That's what I'm going to do.
And maybe they were, maybe we don't have that information. I know I sure as hell would have been.
Yeah. Well, and again, there's a difference between like the official search and then like side party searches, right? So, and I would say or assume that Mullen is testifying around like the official police search, not, whatever citizens wanted to be doing, right? So there's no reason why that necessarily has to be that the families weren't still out looking or anything like that.
Yeah.
So let's move on to day 3. Day 3 took place Monday, October 21st, 2024. And I just want to warn everybody here, this is where things get a little bit graphic. So if this isn't for you, you could skip ahead or pause or stop listening, whatever. So anyhow, day 3 of the trial was a very emotional day for everyone involved. This is when the prosecution showed the crime scene evidence, including photos. In total, there were 117 crime scene photos shown on a large TV in the courtroom. Some of them were very graphic. They were narrated by an Indiana State Police representative. When the photos from the crime scene were shown, they depicted the victims lying in the woods. Both of their throats had been cut. Libby was naked, face and hands covered in blood. Abby was found in jeans and a sweatshirt, blood on the neck and on her clothes. She was wearing Libby's clothes, though. One crime scene investigator testified that Abby's jeans and jacket had been found in the river, as well as Libby's t-shirt. The ground was saturated with blood, and there was blood on a nearby tree. Their bodies were covered with tree limbs and branches, and detectives first processed Libby's body. They checked her for defensive wounds first, then they moved on to look for DNA. When asked, the prosecution said that they did not recover any DNA from Richard Allen at the scene. The investigators did not originally collect the sticks as evidence, but did go back later and collect them. The first person to testify was Carroll County Sheriff's Detective Darren Giancola. Giancola testified that he was off duty on February 13th, 2017, the day the girls went missing. After seeing social media posts about the disappearance of the girls, Giancola testified that he reported to the Carroll County Sheriff's Department on February 13th, 2017. He went to the trails near the Monon High Bridge, where he started his search with other first responders. And he's quoted as saying, "I have worked in this field for a while, not knowing who they were. Usually would have juveniles go missing, and that they would be at a movie or something with their friends, but they would usually show back up." He continued his testimony regarding the search efforts on February 14th, 2017. He said he was the first law enforcement officer to arrive at the crime scene. He said he was called to the area to view footage from a possible trail camera, and he was asked to head to Deer Creek because we were told members of the search party had found something, possibly bodies. He continued to testify of seeing multiple people in the area of Deer Creek, and he said he saw a multicolored shirt and a shoe in the water. He said when he first saw the bodies of Abby and Libby, one was nude and the other was clothed. He told the court that he did not perform life-saving measures on the girls because it was apparent they were deceased. He recalled Abby had blood near her wound, but Libby had blood all over her body, and the ground beneath their bodies was also saturated in blood. Giancola said that he secured the crime scene and called for backup, and the Indiana State Police had then arrived. So this is the first time that we get any information on the actual crime scene, because up to this point, the police hadn't said anything. And again, it goes back to what we talked about the last episode. They were incredibly quiet about what was happening because, as you know, they did not collect any DNA evidence. So they knew that they had to pin the suspect by being at the crime scene and other circumstantial evidence that would ultimately lead to just no reasonable doubt that this person was there, right? Short of a confession. But that's why they were so guarded. And so now, as you know, the girls were apparently killed by a sharp object, probably a knife. And so, and it sounds like it was there right at that scene, right? There was a lot of blood everywhere. So again, when you think about the crime scene, it wasn't clean in that area. So that means that there obviously was something that had happened. However, the thing that I question is how he controlled both girls, and, you know, how did the killer actually murder them without much struggle, it seems like.
Well, we don't know if there was much struggle, but another interesting point is, why was Abby in Libby's clothes? Why would he have had them switch each other's clothes? And, then, some of Libby's clothing items were in the water.
Yeah, I mean, I have a theory about that, and, we'll talk about it later, but I'll start saying it now, right? So I think there was an intent to sexually assault these girls. So my guess is that the killer led them to an area and started down that path, but then got spooked by something and quickly had them probably get dressed or grab their things or whatever, and then continued on to where he ultimately ends up murdering them because he's scared.
It makes sense. We're going to be talking about some of that a little bit more detail later on, but it makes sense. Maybe he had both of them take their clothes off, and his intent was sexual assault before murder. And then, if they started to panic, make noise, he freaked out and then told them to hurry up and get dressed, and Libby didn't. I'm going to make sure I got my facts straight here. I think was...
Yeah, Libby was the one who was naked.
Abby had Libby's clothes on, so maybe Libby started to yell or scream or panic, and then he freaked out and killed her before she put the clothes back on, and then he dumped them in the water. I don't know. I'm just speculating.
Right, yeah. I don't know that and I don't believe we find any of that out. Like, we don't know the exact detail of what had happened that night, or that afternoon, I should say. But, yeah, it's a super bizarre it's weird. Like you're speculating constantly because you just want to know how did this happen? And the one thing I will say to the girls' credit, they never split up, right? They easily could have split. They're in the woods. It's one of those things where it's really sad, but they were together. They were best friends, and they stuck it through to the end. And neither one of them abandoned the other. In a way, you wish one of them would have at least, just so that we could have maybe come to a resolution sooner, or one of them would have at least remained alive, right?
Or at least give them the chance, right, to tell the story of what happened. But, as we learned during part 1, though, there was an unspent bullet that was found. So he may have had a gun drawn on him at the same time he had a knife drawn on him. So they were, terrified to run and thinking that they're just going to get gunned down, right?
Yeah, I mean, and they're young girls. It's asking a lot in a panic situation like that. But I will say, police always say you should always fight and run. Do not ever succumb to your captor.
Yeah.
It just usually doesn't end well for you if you do.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes the most sense, but like you said, we're talking about young teenagers.
Yeah, and it's scary. You don't know what was happening. And the other thing you don't really know or realize, because I've never been there at least, is what the terrain was like in the area where he came upon them. So they were obviously on the bridge. We think we have Bridge Guy. If Bridge Guy is the killer, which everyone agrees is, then what was the terrain like when he finally approached them? Were they in a precarious situation because that bridge was it's up high off the ground? Did they feel like they had no other choice but to comply because they couldn't really escape? I don't know what the other side of the bridge looks like. Where is it flat? Is it still crazy terrain? Is it like a scary area where you don't really have anywhere to get out? I don't know for sure, but it's just another wrinkle in the whole thing. And it's just ultimately sad. It's incredibly sad. Yeah. So a second witness was called by the state to testify. His name was Jason Page. Page is an Indiana State Police crime scene investigator responsible for photographing the crime scene. He referenced the topography of the crime scene and said that there was a substantial amount of blood found on Libby and the area where the girls' bodies were found. Tree branches were found on the girls' bodies. A large branch appeared over Libby's upper body. When asked to describe the terrain, Page said it's pretty rough and steep. While showing the jury a map, he described the area called Ground Zero and the path leading to the girls' bodies. Page described a water search conducted by the dive team and the areas they searched with metal detectors. And as the photos were being shown to the courtroom, many jurors put their hands on their heads, squirmed, sighed, and turned red as they saw photographs of the girls' bodies. One juror put a hand over their mouth. Some family members had to turn away while visibly sobbing at the images. Richard Allen looked at the photos and was taking notes. He did not show any visible emotion. And Judge Gall took a longer recess to allow the jury to take a break after a tough morning. So Page does talk about the terrain. It is a rough terrain. Like I was just saying, I don't know in that particular area where he overcame the girls if that was the case or if there was an escape route. We just don't know. It's all speculation because we don't really know where they were taken exactly. We have some ideas, but I don't think anyone truly knows.
I mean, they probably didn't know his intentions when they were confronted on the bridge. We hear in the audio, he's telling them to go down the hill. So they're getting off of the bridge and they're entering that rough terrain. But I just wish they would have pushed his fucking ass off the bridge or at least fought with him and took their chances.
That would have been one hell of a story if they would have knocked him off the bridge. It would have had a better end to it than what ultimately happened.
Absolutely.
So after the recess, there was a heated cross-exam between defense attorney Brad Rozzi and Jason Page. Rozzi asked several questions regarding the unspent bullet. The bullet is one of the main pieces of evidence that investigators say ties Allen to the crime. And I don't think we've talked about it yet much. That should come a little bit later, but we already mentioned it in part 1. Rozzi asked why there weren't more photos taken of the bullet on the ground and why there are no pictures of the bullet while it was being removed from the ground and after it was removed from the scene. And attorneys raised several questions about the sticks and branches found on and around the girls' bodies during Monday's sessions. Photos of Libby's body, the sticks, and blood found in the area were shown in court, and the defense questioned investigators on whether they think the sticks may have been placed there by someone. Page said it was reasonable to believe it was placed there by a human act. The third witness called to the stand Monday. Actually, before we dive into this particular line of questioning, the defense is starting to wedge the door open for the Odinism theory with this line of questioning. So we talked about that just the other day, in part 1 about Odinism and it being ruled out as an area the defense could open the door to, right? And so this is a direct line because the way that the sticks were laid and the way the bodies were, that's what they're getting at with this line of questioning. They're trying to wedge that door open. They're trying to get somebody to say something that allows them then to introduce the Odinism theory. So if your cult theory thing is your thing, I guess it was a really smart tactic, but again, it's like they're grasping at straws just from at day 3 alone.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And kudos for them. Not that I'm saying great that they start entering in this speculation or questionable doubt as to what happened, but where in the hell did they get the lead that it could be Odinism based on how the bodies were placed on the ground, how the sticks were laid out and whatever? Kind of interesting to me, or, I'm curious to know how they pulled that angle off.
Well, I think it was based off of a known Odinist in the area. His son had ties to one of the girls, if memory serves. And so they're trying to basically piece all that back. And then supposedly that guy admitted to killing the girls or something to that effect. I believe we mentioned it at the end of the last episode. But yeah, it's a stretch. Let's just put it that way. It's definitely a stretch. But I do applaud the defense because that is their job, is to supply enough doubt that you have to think twice before you make a conviction. And you really should in these cases, right? It's a very serious crime to be charged with. And as we know in other cases, wrongful incrimination happens regularly. And so just making sure that you're getting the right person, introducing these things in there as counter evidence is always good. It's healthy in a way. This particular one with Odinism is a little bit of a stretch for me, but I like that they're trying to actually put reasonable doubt into the equation for the jury. So the third witness called to the stand was Dwayne Datsman. He's an ISP crime scene technician and was responsible for taking photos of the crime scene as well. And he testified that he was the crime scene investigator who discovered the bullet that was found between the girls' bodies. And he stated that he was responsible for the aerial photos of the crime scene from a helicopter. He was cross-examined by Andrew Baldwin, the defense attorney, and Baldwin tried to emphasize the defense's interest in the bullet at the crime scene, arguing that they believe more photos should have been taken of the bullet found at the scene. Baldwin was quoted as saying, "Would you agree with me that a bullet found at the crime scene should be photographically documented?" His response was yes. Baldwin then asked why no videos were taken of the bullet. Datsman said the photos would be better. Baldwin was working to cast doubt on the crime scene investigation techniques. Baldwin then asked, "If you had to do it all over again, would you have taken a photograph of the other end of that bullet?" And Datsman said, "If I had to, I imagine I would have." Indiana State Police CSIs photographed the scene and testifying to hundreds of images taken to preserve what the scene looked like and the evidence. And the big question was, why didn't they take the sticks and branches originally from the crime scene that were found on Abby and Libby's bodies? This is after Datsman testified to coming back to the crime scene in March to retrieve the branches that they had moved off of the bodies of Abby and Libby. Datsman said, for the most part, those branches were very rough texture and they were crumbly. I'm not confident DNA would have transferred well. And Baldwin continued to ask about why the sticks weren't tested for DNA or removed from the crime scene originally. And he said, we can't go picking up every stick and every leaf that's in the forest there just because it might have a drop of blood on it. That's an interesting response, but I think due to the nature of the way that the bodies were and the way that the sticks were, that's a valid question in my mind.
It is a valid question, and especially for the sticks that were laid directly on the bodies, why would they not have been collected up front? As you went on to say, they came back in March to get them. I mean, even if it was early March, that's 2 weeks with weather and animal traffic or whatever. There still could have been DNA evidence from the killer on those sticks had they been collected immediately.
Right, and I don't know how quickly certain DNA deteriorates in the weather. If it rains a lot, is like blood evidence mostly gone now, or is it so contaminated? Like, I don't know. I'm not a forensic expert, so I couldn't tell you. I would assume, though, it makes it significantly more difficult to test for it, though.
Yeah, it has to. I mean, your odds are definitely better collecting it at the point in time of the investigation. And I mean, it's kind of pointless to go back 2 weeks later, to be completely honest. Unless that crime scene is contained and completely closed and isolated, that seems silly to me.
So next up, the state called Brian Alehi, an ISP crime scene investigator, to the stand. Alehi was responsible for photographing the crime scene as well, and he explained how ISP took photos of the crime scene and the way it was when they found it before carefully removing items, individually packaging them, and sending them to an ISP lab to store them. So all witnesses were asked if they had weapons on them the day that they were at the crime scene. 2 of them stated they were not carrying them. And this is a point driven heavily by the defense, who say that it could be possible that the bullet at the scene could have come from law enforcement officers' weapons, not Allen's. So during Alehi's testimony, he shared crime scene photos of both Abby and Libby's bodies. And in the photos, Alehi testified to Abby wearing Libby's jeans and that they were muddy and wet. And he testified to silt or dirt being on Abby's clothing and feet, despite her having a shoe on. Alehi also stated that they found Libby's phone and shoe under Abby's body. So again, I think this goes back to what we were first talking about, which is what was the intent of this and what happened. And it sounds like at some point, like, all shoes are off, like he's stripping them down, basically, is what it sounds like. And then for some reason, I think there's some sort of a panic, and then they take off, or whatever. He instructs them to get dressed and go, and then freaks out and ends up murdering the girls.
It certainly sounds that way. I mean, that's what I would gather just from the information we've provided so far. There could have been the area where they were murdered could have still been a visible line of sight to the bridge, and there could have been more people on the bridge, and he freaked out thinking that one of these girls yells or screams, or maybe they did. Then panic, set on, and he's trying to get them dressed and get them out of there. Struggle ensues, and they end up victims. All right, so now we're going to move on to day 4 of the trial, Tuesday, October 22nd, 2024. The focus of day 4 was around the evidence collected at the scene. Some of the evidence included a Converse shoe, a shoe found on the body of Abby, a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson cartridge, a collection of strands of fibrous materials, swabs of blood, and the girls' bodies. Other sources have reported that some of the evidence obtained was some Hollister blue jeans, a tie-dye shirt, a gray sweatshirt which was medium in size, Sonomo brand pink underwear, black and purple socks, a pink sock, a green headscarf, a black Faded Glory spaghetti strap shirt, Converse tennis shoes, a strand of material found between fingers on Abby's right hand, Libby's phone, and a black Nike tennis shoe under Abby's body.
Yeah, so that's kind of the list of, generally what the evidence entailed from the girls from the crime scene. So basically all of their clothing, or most of their clothing, and the gun cartridge that they found, the Smith & Wesson bullet, and blood. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Nothing extraordinary, but also Libby's phone, which proved to be quite major.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder what the fibrous material was that they referred to. I wonder if he was trying to bind them up during the attack.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know what that would be, or if it was just potentially some sort of other material. I don't know, maybe from other clothing or hair or something like that.
Obviously not DNA related.
Yeah, not in the end. We ended up not getting DNA, so yeah, you're right about that.
All right. So continuing on, the testimony turned to the items collected during the autopsy. There were sexual assault evidence kits entered as evidence for Abby Williams and Libby German, as well as various articles of clothing the girls were wearing when their bodies were found. Upon cross-examination by Allen's attorney, Bradley Rossi asked Alehi if the Smith & Wesson bullet found at the crime scene is, quote, one of the most common rounds. Alehi responded, quote, I would say no. There were several follow-up questions regarding what the defense calls the, quote, magic bullet, a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson round. The defense really focused on trying to poke holes in the security of the crime scene as well as the way the evidence was handled and collected. O'Leahy was asked about the integrity of the crime scene and private information, and whether he was aware of information about a breach of the crime scene. He also stated from the stand that he did not think the way sticks were found on the bodies was an attempt to communicate something. The early afternoon session on Tuesday focused on another main piece of evidence in the Delphi Murders trial. It is a video of the girls and the bridge guy that was taken on Libby German's phone. Indiana State Police Lieutenant Brian Bunner, a digital forensic expert, testified about his role in examining information captured from the phone. Testimony began with State Exhibit 182, a Google Earth map illustration that includes measurements of the area of the Delphi High Bridge. Lieutenant Bunner discussed digital forensics and other categories involved in dissecting evidence. He specializes in data captured from cell phones and computers. Bunner testified that when a cell phone like Libby's is taken for evidence, they start with a manual examination of the phone's exterior. Bunner said numerous photos of the phone were taken before they tried to extract any data from it. Investigators then extracted the data and used the processing software called Cellebrite to put the information into a readable format. The first report on the iPhone 6s was processed on February 15, 2017. Bunner's first exam is called Method 1 technology. It pulls messages, voicemails, internet browsing history, photos, and more. From an iPhone, that data is plugged into a computer and then extracted through Cellebrite. Carroll County Prosecutor Nicholas McClellan asked if Lieutenant Bunner looked through the entire report. Bunner is quoted as stating the report was several hundred pages long. If we went through every single line by line, that would take forever. Time was of the essence, and we wanted to get it back to investigators as soon as possible, so they looked at the last user activity. McClellan asked if he looked at the camera on the phone and why. Lieutenant Bunner said the timeline reports showed a video. It was a video taken at 2:13 p.m. on February 13, 2017, the day Abby and Libby were last seen alive. The video, which lasted only 35 to 40 seconds, was shown once on a large television monitor in the courtroom. The video shows Libby filming herself and Abby on the Delphi High Bridge. At one point, the camera points up and you can see there is no one behind Abby. However, in a later shot, it shows a man walking behind her. That man has been called the Bridge Man. They received the phone again on February 21st, 2017, and did another extract, but did not pull any new information. Later in the day, an audio-video technician from Indiana State Police named Jeremy Chapman took the stand. He was responsible for enhancing the audio and video from the phone that was widely shared with the media as authorities looked for the bridge guy. Judge Gall allowed the enhanced version of the video to be played in court Tuesday afternoon. It was about 45 seconds long. They played the video in its entirety a second time. In the video, the girls are heard saying, "See, this is the path. There is no path. We have to go down here." Shortly after, a man's voice says, "Guys, down the hill."
Yeah, so that's a lot, right? He just went through a ton of stuff. And to me, this is like one of the biggest pieces of the trial, is just going through the cell phone information and understanding what was going on. Now, later on, there will be a little bit more, I think, that we talk about in terms of what was on this phone. But just from what we know now, right, they're able to put together some sort of a timeline based on the events that had happened, the posts made to social media, all of those things. And so police had more information, again, than what they were sharing with the public, but they weren't releasing it all. They wanted to release the video of Bridge Guy, and that was just simply because they were hoping somebody might identify him because he had an unusual walk and maybe his clothing or something. And so they released that. But the things I find fascinating here is how the police are using these tools like Cellebrite to go rip data off of phones. You know, I'm a nerd. I love technology. I'm into this stuff. I hear about Cellebrite all the time. It's used all over the place. Like government agencies use it to break into phones all the time. So it's just fascinating to see what they're able to pull off of it. So obviously the first things they're looking at are like voicemails, text messages, internet history, photos, all the obvious stuff. You're like just trying to figure out like, okay, is there anything here that's incriminating anybody? Is there anything here that could give us a clue? And so that's basically what they're doing, right? And police even say, we immediately went in here and extracted a bunch of stuff off the phone and started looking through it as quickly as possible, going for the most obvious recent stuff, and then got the phone back to law enforcement so that they could have it if they needed it for anything. Then they again took another deeper dive, and didn't seem like they pulled anything else special off the phone. But that was just where we started, from that moment.
From the hundreds and hundreds of pages of data that they did pull off the phone, it's apparent that the most important thing that they gathered from that phone was that 45-second video capturing that bridge guy walking up behind them, and then capturing some of the audio from their conversation before the video cuts off. The girls are, somewhat arguing with them, saying, see, this is the path. There is no path, going back and forth. And I'm assuming the bridge guy's saying we have to go down here. Or no, it would have been the girls. The girls are saying we have to go down here. So, they're obviously a little bit intimidated by, leaving the bridge and having to be what must have been a pretty treacherous walk down to wherever they were going. And then we simply get that piece of audio that we've played in the trailer and we've all heard is, he's like, guys, down the hill.
Right. And again, it all comes back to having this cell phone data, just being able to use that. But in this moment, right, this is what they're hearing.
Guys. Down the hill. Guys. Down the hill. Guys. Down the hill.
Like, how creepy is that?
It's super creepy. And then the only thing that was shared was the guys down the hill. I don't think any of the audio was shared of the girls the back and forth conversation with him, right?
No, I've never come across any evidence that had any of their voices, or you never hear them going back and forth. Now, obviously, I think they're doing some of that inside the trial in the courtroom, but it's not stuff that the public has heard. And then I guess real quick, there were a few other testimonies that day, and it was Riley Voorhees, Betsy Blair, and Brian Wilbur, and they were all testifying about seeing Bridge Guy that day. The thing is, though, the reports aren't all that credible, and they don't line up with the description of what Richard Allen looks like. A lot of them report like a tall or muscular man, or a man with poofy hair, and Richard Allen's actually quite short, like 5'5", I think. He's a pretty short guy. So, again, just not really worth going through their testimony, but worth noting that it happened.
Yeah. I think that was probably just a, spur of the moment thing where they saw somebody and just wanted to report it, right? It sounds like that's a pretty popular hiking trail. So, hats off to them for coming forward and saying, hey, we saw somebody on that day, but it didn't line up from what we saw in the video or what we know of Alan now.
Yeah, and again, the other weird thing about like witness testimony is it's pretty unreliable. There's also these things where you find out what had happened, and then you decide you're going to report seeing somebody, but now in your mind that person is larger than life because of the events that took place. So like maybe they did cross Bridge Man, maybe he is pretty short, but in their mind now, knowing what just happened and what that person was capable of, they become bigger, literally. Like you just imagine them as a bigger, stronger person to do something so heinous to somebody,
right?
Versus what you may have actually seen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll move on to day 5 of the trial, which was Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024. The trial opened with the defense filing a motion to submit evidence to support Odinism, and then they moved on to examining the witnesses. So next up was Sarah Carball, and she lived near the trail and visited it daily to walk her dogs. And the highlight of her testimony was that she said she saw Bridge Guy covered in mud and blood walking away from the trails as she drove by. She claimed he was caked in a lot of mud and was looking very suspicious. The defense pointed out that she's changed her version of the story several times. So they've interviewed her 3 different times, and in the first interview she mentioned 11 times about this person being covered in mud. That was in 2017, and 0 mentions of blood. And then in her second interview, there was 13 mentions of mud and 0 of blood. And then in her third interview in 2019, she mentions mud 0 times, but 16 times she mentions blood. So she denies all of that and insisted that her story has never changed. And when the defense attorney asked if she wanted to review the transcript, she read through it and acknowledges that it's not in there. And she insisted nothing changed, but when the defense attorney asked her to review the second and third script, she became very defensive. And when pressing on the change in the stories, she asked if we're going to do this again. And he said, yes. And then she said, I saw a bridge guy walking on the side of the road covered in mud and blood, and that's that. And then another exchange was when asked by the jury how far away she was, she said she was 3 feet away. And the defense attorney said that when you talked to police, you were 20 feet away, and she was getting pressed on all of these small details and was extremely defensive. So it's important to note that the state and defense both shied away from asking eyewitnesses if Richard Allen is the bridge guy. So again, they're just trying to kind of paint the picture of the day, and they're really not. They haven't really mentioned Richard Allen to this point, really at all, right? So we're on the 5th day of the trial, and he's not even mentioned to this point. We've just talked about all of the circumstances going on around the trial.
Yeah. Well, I think with the line of questioning with Sarah, they probably come to the conclusion that, hey, we're not going to ask the question, is Richard Allen the bridge guy that you saw? You know, we haven't brought him up to this point, but he's in the courtroom, and either side of the, you know, the prosecution or the defense could have said, is that the guy you saw walking down the road with mud and blood on his clothes? But I think they shied away from that because, like you mentioned just a minute ago, some of the testimony from witnesses is very inconsistent. So they don't want to put any kind of doubt in the jury's mind, or from the defense side. Either way, they don't want to influence the jury, because how credible is the information that she is providing here? And they don't want to say, is that the guy you saw? Yes or no?
Yeah, exactly. You got to be very careful. So again, day 5 was pretty jam-packed, so let's kind of rip through some of this to get to the meaty part. But they did ask Dr. Roland Core, I might be saying that wrong, Roland Core, to testify. He did the autopsy, and so he talked about the steps of an autopsy and how he did the examination of the bodies. And the first autopsy was performed on Abby. He noted Abby's clothing, any physical injuries, and performed a rape kit test. He said that Abby had a 1-inch deep and 3-inch long incision wound on her neck. She also had a faint mark under her mouth, which Core said could be from duct tape or cloth. Abby showed no signs of blunt force trauma or restraint wounds. He said that though the rape kit showed no overt injury patterns, it does not mean that sexual contact didn't occur. Libby German's autopsy was performed second. Core also noted her clothing, physical injuries, and performed a rape kit. The autopsy report said that Libby had anywhere from 3 to 5 incision wounds on the right side of her neck, the largest being around 3.5 inches long. She also showed no signs of overt sexual trauma or defensive wounds. Core estimated the girls died approximately 41 hours before the autopsy. Defense attorney Brad Rozzi began his cross-examination and discussed Core's deposition from February 2024. Core's deposition included information about the attack and speculation on the girls' reactions after being attacked. He said in the February deposition that he couldn't determine if the killer was left or right-handed, and that a serrated knife may have been used. Core then said after his deposition that a box cutter may have been used instead of a serrated knife, but did not inform the defense. Rozzi became upset in the courtroom after Core admitted his uncertainty about the weapon used and did not file a new report. So, you know, obviously just kind of the basics around an autopsy there. Nothing extremely crazy other than just noting the wounds on the girls. Next up, State Police First Sergeant Christopher Cecil testifies on cell phone forensics. So this part's pretty meaty. It's quite interesting. So when the trial resumed at 2 p.m., Sergeant Cecil of the Indiana State Police said he's been in law enforcement for 20 years, and he took the stand. He has a college degree in digital forensics, and in 2019 became a computer forensics examiner for the state police. He joined the Delphi Murders investigation and volunteered to examine Libby's phone. Cecil analyzed the iPhone and the SIM card inside first in 2019 using a gray key device from state police. The device is capable of unlocking iPhones and other similar devices, unlike previous software was able to. In the analysis, Cecil produced a full data extraction of the phone's content and reviewed that by putting it into a program called Celebrite. This review lasted between late July 2019 and late August 2019. His goal was to extract the data and create a timeline of events based on the phone's usage starting February 13, 2017, the day that the police believe Abby and Libby were murdered. Cecil compiled a report in 2019 on what he found in Libby's phone. Some highlights. 2 people were using Libby's phone. Many apps had logons for Abby and Libby. There were several fingerprints saved to the phone, including Abby's. The health app on the phone was working in the background and recorded steps taken, changes in elevation, and distances traveled. Cecil outlined that information for the jurors. The phone also made 2 calls, was plugged into a power source, and posted photos to Snapchat on February 13, 2017. The phone also recorded the bridge guy video, which jurors watched. This year, Cecil compiled a second report, including more extensive information from the iPhone using a program that state police called Knowledge C. The software was able to provide a more detailed view of the day's timeline. Analysis from the report happened between May 10th and August 18th of this year. Here's a brief breakdown. So at 1:41 p.m. on February 13th, 2017, a picture was posted from the phone to Libby's Snapchat account. At 1:43 p.m. that same day, another picture was posted to Snapchat. At 2:05 p.m. on February 13th, a picture of the Monon High Bridge was posted to Snapchat. The phone last unlocked at 2:07 p.m. February 13th, 2017, although someone failed to unlock it with a fingerprint about 7 minutes later. At 2:13 p.m., the bridge guy video is recorded. At 2:14 p.m., someone attempts to unlock the iPhone but fails. The last recorded movement from the phone was at 2:32 p.m. on February 13th, 2017. The last signal from the phone came about 10:32 p.m. on February 13th, 2017. Cecil reported that he had thought the phone had died. He found no indication that the phone was turned off from 2:13 p.m. to 4:33 a.m. on the 14th, when the phone received calls and texts late into the day on February 13th. At 4:06 p.m. on February 13th, Libby's grandmother texted, "You need to call me now." The phone stopped receiving notifications late February 13th until 4:33 a.m. on the 14th, when about 20 SMS text messages came in. So there's a lot to unpack there, but to me, there becomes a question about that timeline and why at 4:33 a.m. all of a sudden there's all these messages that come in. My suspicion is the phone started draining battery and went into a sort of power reserve state, and or was just trapped underneath the bodies of the girls and didn't really get signal. And then right before it died, it was able to catch signal and all these messages came through. But again, it's real fascinating. You get a really clear picture of the timeline of events right there, just based on that cell phone data.
And I agree. It's a very detailed account of what happened that day. I didn't pick that up at first, but yeah, why would it all of a sudden start getting messages at 4:33 a.m.? That's kind of weird.
It is a little weird, but technology is weird. I don't personally subscribe to there's anything weird about it other than it just randomly caught signal right about then for whatever reason. I don't know if it goes, like I said, into a more of a power save type of state if the battery starts to drain to a certain percentage just to try to keep things limping along for a little longer. So if it stops fetching things as frequently, if it stops pushing out as much of a signal to try to connect with the cell towers, I'm not sure. But what I will say is I've seen things like this before. It's not unusual.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I know when your phone dies, it warns you. It says, hey, we're going to shut down now, and goes through a little bit of a cycle, and then it shuts off. So I don't know if it's like that last-ditch effort to clear its queue of anything that's coming or going and then shuts itself down. Yep. Very possible. One thing I can confirm is your phone is watching you every step of the day. Everything you do, it's listening. Lots of conspiracy theories on what your phone does and doesn't do and any other kind of internet-based technology in your home. But I mean, in this case, I'm glad that they were able to glean this much information out of her phone, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right, everybody, please join us back here again for part 3 of the Delphi Murders, the trial of Richard Allen. If you'd be so kind, follow us on our social medias. We are on Instagram and Threads at Killer Podcast, on X at Killer_podcast. You can email the show, killerpodcast@gmail.com, or you can head out to our website, which is currently under construction but almost ready, killerpodcast.org. There you'll find our latest episodes, supporting materials for the shows. You can also subscribe to our Patreon from our website. And anything you can do to support the show would go a really long way for Craig and myself as we spend a lot of time doing our research and editing, and fuel us with some caffeine if you don't mind. All right, Craig, any final words?
I couldn't agree more. Yes, any way you can support the show, we're very appreciative. Even word of mouth. If you've had family and friends that have listened to the show in the past, make sure you pass the word along. I've talked to some friends and they're surprised that we're back after 5 years. So they started downloading the latest episode right away. So anything you can do to help us keep pushing forward. We're looking forward to the next part of the Delphi murder trials and all of the new content to come after that.
All right, everybody, stay safe.